So it is a pleasure for us to have Dr. Joe Brooks with us today. Joe did his undergraduate degree at CMU in biological sciences and psychology. He then did his PhD at UC Berkeley with Professor Stephen Palmer and Lynn Robertson, working on visual perceptual organization and studying patients with spatial neglect. He then moved to London, to UCL, to John Driver's lab to do a postdoc there. And after that, he got a position at the University of Kent. He was also a co-director of the Center of Cognitive Neuroscience and Cognitive Systems there until moving to Kiel University, where he is now and where he runs his research. His research focuses on studying human visual perceptual processes such as perceptual grouping, figure-ground organization, perceptual ambiguity, visual illusions, and he uses psychophysics, EEG, brain stimulation, and healthy patients. And I must confess that I know Joe from for quite a while, since we've been together at UCL. We've collaborated. It's been a pleasure. He's also been to Israel, which was also nice. And we're very pleased to have you today and to hear about your research. So welcome to our seminar.
Hey, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. I just wasn't sure if I muted I have this paranoia about muting things now, but thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. It's a real pleasure. Although I do hope to be able to come visit you in person sometime soon again, because it was such a wonderful trip there last time I was visiting. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the work I've been doing across several years now. So this is work that spans my time working with Steve Palmer in Berkeley, as well as John Driver in London, and some work I've done more recently as well. And I'm talking about because I think all of these different projects hang together under a particular theme. And that is a theme of starting to realize some of the relationships I think may exist between different perceptual organization processes, such as grouping and figure ground organization. So I want to give you a sense first of the phenomena. If you look at this image, I wonder, what do you see here? So this could be an image, for instance, of some wood, maybe a deck with some sort of shiny slime running over top of it. That's one interpretation of it. But with a bit more context, you can probably see that this is actually really just maybe a wooden deck, but with a hole in it, a hole in the wood, and you can see down to the sea below. And the key thing is here that depth ambiguity about edges in the image. So can you see my cursor now? Here, I think you should be able to.
Yeah.
The depth ambiguity about this edge can drastically change your interpretation of the shapes that are present in this scene. So if you see the edge assigned in one direction, so if the edge is assigned towards the grayish shiny region, then you're more likely to perceive this as an oozing shiny blob of stuff oozing over the surface of the wood. If the edge is assigned to the wooden planks, then you're more likely to see the interpretation where this is a wooden deck with a hole down to the sea. So the key message here is that the shapes that you perceive depend on the assignment of the edges in this image. And sometimes this is called edge assignment, sometimes it's called figure ground organization. There are several different words that are used to capture this idea of edge assignment. Now, there's a lot of work that's shown this before, this relationship between perceived shape and edge assignment. So some people have suggested it's an obligatory process. So Gordon Bayless and John Driver have done work in the past, as well as others, suggesting that once you assign an edge, once you see an image, edge assignment will definitely happen, and it must happen. And the key thing is that once figure ground organization happens, this indicates aspects of depth, shape and interpolation for an image. So for instance, when you have this ambiguous figure here, this could be a black shape with soft rounded bumps on it overlapping a white surface, or it could be a white object with sharp spiky points overlapping a black surface. And the key thing is that, this has profound implications for how you interact with the objects in the scene and what you see. So, for instance, with the soft rounded bumps, I may want to reach out and feel that surface, and it may be a nice soft surface. Whereas the way I orientate my hand towards this object with sharp spiky points on it would be very different. I certainly wouldn't want to grab it from the left-hand side. So this process of edge assignment has ongoing consequences for how we interact with the world and the objects that we perceive in it. The ambiguity that we see around figure ground organization is well known, and it's been popularized by images like Rubin's Vase's Vase. This is a classic case of shape ambiguity. So this is actually a wooden vase-like object I have in my office that the edge of that actually represents the edge of my face that's been carved into wood. So there's actually a website where you can have your face carved into wood, your profile of your face carved into wood. I think it still exists. Turnyourhead.com was when I got this. This is obviously a much younger version of me when I had hair. But Her Majesty and Prince Philip have one of these as well, with their faces carved into a vase. I'm sure this was a gift, which is quite nice. And you can even see depth, figure ground ambiguity in socks. So I found this nice pair of socks where you can have ambiguity of the directions of the arrows. So if you see the black regions as figural, then you'll see arrows pointing towards the right. If you see the blue regions as figural, then you'll see the arrows pointing to the left, and that this can oscillate back and forth your interpretation of these images. So there's lots of opportunity for figure ground ambiguity and thus shape ambiguity in scenes. Now, a key question is, how do you resolve this ambiguity that is present? Because presumably it's not only present in these curious examples that are fun to look at, but it's presumably present in all images that we look at. And the classic answer to that has been that there are a collection of all sorts of different cues in images that you can pick up on. Any given image may have one or usually multiple different cues that will help you resolve this ambiguity. And some of these include things like the smallness of the area. So for instance, smaller areas like this black region here tend to be seen as the figure in front of a larger background. Convexity, symmetry. So for instance, these black symmetrical regions tend to look more like figures in front of white backgrounds rather than these asymmetric regions, asymmetric white regions being the figures. Mary Peterson has popularized the idea of familiarity being a cue to figure ground organization. So a region that looks like a familiar object. So this black region here looks like the silhouette of a lamp, that region will be have a stronger advantage in the competition for figural status because of your past experience with that region being a figure. And there are many others. Some of these are long-standing, from the early 1900s. Other ones maybe in the 90s, and then there's been a resurgence of interest in this in the 2000s with various people coming out with other types of configural image-based cues to figure ground organization. Okay. Now, the fact that we have a list of cues like this reminds many people and makes many people think about figure ground organization like perceptual grouping, because perceptual grouping also has lists of cues that we tend to associate with resolving ambiguity in the images. So, but one thing that I found is that although these two phenomena differ, figure ground and grouping, sometimes people see them as very much the same process. So I've written papers before on figure ground organization and submitted them. And I've gotten comments back suggesting that this grouping phenomenon, this grouping thing has been done before. And my response to that is usually, well, I haven't written a paper on grouping. I've written a paper on figure ground organization. So why are you judging it as if it's a grouping paper? So there seems to be a bit of a confusion about these phenomena being the same thing. I think sometimes people use the word grouping to encompass anything that is perceptual organization. So this is sort of my reviewer number 2 experience that I have regularly, which is very frustrating. But they seem like very different phenomena. Figure ground organization is really about edges and depth and occlusion in some ways. To which region does this edge belong here? This face vase profile, does the edge belong to this outer region, to these outer regions, or to the inner region? Whereas grouping is about what goes together, and it's typically shown by little sets of dots or shapes that you try to figure out, do these 2 dots go together to form a group, or is it these 2 dots that go together to form a group? So what are the arrangements of different types of objects in the scene to create higher level structures? So these 2 things appear side by side in textbooks, but they're not the same thing. But my experience with reviewer number 2, constantly coming back with this idea that they're somehow related, really started to force myself and Steve Palmer and some of my other collaborators to start questioning this idea. If it's so intuitive that these 2 things are related, why do we never actually talk about them having some common mechanism or being involved with one another? Even though reviewer number 2 thinks they are, we never had any papers suggesting that they work together or similar processes. So maybe there is some relationship between figure ground organization and grouping that we've never explored. So the way we started to think about this was we started to realize, well, even if you think about the language that I've used to define these 2 processes, maybe there are similarities between them. So figure ground organization is to which region does the edge belong? And grouping is about what goes or belongs together. Well, both of those definitions or ideas talks about what belongs with what. In one case, it's edges belonging to regions or being grouped with regions. And in the other case with grouping, it's about objects or elements being grouped together. And if you think about that, well, to which region does the edge belong does sound a lot like with which region does the edge group. And that suggests that figure ground organization may actually have some sort of grouping process going on. So if I could find some way to take this edge and group it with a region, that may make that edge belong to the region and thus affect figure ground organization. So this made us start to think seriously about reviewer number 2's, what reviewer number 2 is implicitly suggesting, perhaps, that there is a relationship between these 2 processes. And maybe if we can use grouping, maybe we can use grouping as a figure ground cue. And that's not something that had been talked about before as far as we knew. So let me make that a bit more concrete. So the first way that we approached this issue was work that I did with Steve Palmer during my PhD, which was to look at something we called edge region grouping. And I'm going to show you a specific example of this using common fate motion grouping. So the idea here is that if we have a simple bipartite figure like this, so just 2 regions, one black, one white, and we have an edge separating them. If this edge has some feature in common with one of the regions such that it would group with that region, then that should affect figure ground organization in that image. So in this case, we've made the edge have common fate motion with the dots, the textural dots in the left-hand black region, rather than in the white right-hand region. So the idea is this edge should group with that left region, and thus it should be seen as figure ground. For most people, they should see the black region sort of as in front of the white region. And that's certainly my experience. that black region looks like it in front. And that was the experience of our participants broadly as well. So 93% of our participants very strongly saw this black region as in front because as predicted by our edge region grouping hypothesis, if this edge groups with that region, then it should become, that region should become figural. So that was our first inkling that we could use grouping between edges and regions to manipulate figure ground organization. And it suggested some relationship between these two ideas. We then went on to test other ideas related to this edge region grouping hypothesis. So the next one that we tried was blur similarity. So the idea here is that if you are looking at the edge of an object, typically the edge of an object is in the same depth plane or a similar depth plane as the rest of the object, or at least you're fairly close to the same depth plane. So these leaves, for instance, their surfaces are roughly in the same depth plane as the edges of them, but the background region that's behind it is in a very different depth plane. And thus the amount of blur in the edge of an object should be basically the same as the amount of blur in the object itself, whereas it should be different in its amount of, the edge should be different in the amount of blur from a separate background object that's at a different depth plane. That's certainly the case here. The edge is sharp and the features of the object are sharp, whereas the background is blurry. And this is true regardless of where your level of, where your depth of focus is. So if you're focused on the background, for instance, back here, the background will all be sharp. But this edge, which of this person, which is quite blurry, has again the same amount of blur as the rest of the person. So the fact that the blur of the edge is blurry and this surface is blurry suggests that that edge belongs to this surface and not to the rest of this region back here. So the idea here was that blur similarity should tell you something about blur similarity between edge and the regions it's adjacent to should tell you something about the figure ground or edge assignment, figure ground assignment or edge assignment of that edge. And that is what we found when we made these simple dot stimuli as well. So we made stimuli with sharp edges as well as sharp dots on one side and blurry dots on the other side. And we found largely that not as strong as the other experiment, but certainly above chance, the participants preferred to assign this sharp edge to the sharp region. And we see the left side of this image is figural. And when they had a blurry edge, they were more likely to assign that blurry edge to a region with blurry dots than they would be to assign it to sharp dots. So it's not just that people prefer sharp things to be the objects and blurry things not to be the objects. It's something about the relationship between blurriness of the edge and the blurriness of the adjacent surface that affects edge assignment. So we went through and we actually tested a bunch of different grouping principles. So we tested color similarity of edges and textures of the dots in the regions, flicker synchrony, proximity, and orientation similarity. And for all of these different grouping principles, we found evidence that suggested that the amount of edge region grouping between the amount of grouping between edges and regions was a clear predictor of figural status for participants. Now, interestingly, some of the effects that we found were new effects that we hadn't been seeing in the literature before, but as we tested some of these ideas and presented them at conferences, people pointed out that some of the effects had been observed before. So for instance, Jonas and colleagues have published some work on the ideas similar to our common fate experiment. And Weinstein and Wong had done some work on flicker and figure ground organization. They had not related all of these phenomena together, however, under this idea of edge region grouping. And in some cases, their interpretations were quite different. So for instance, Weisstein and Wong, I think, has suggested something about flickering regions always being ground. And flicker was a cue to ground status. However, that's not what we found. What we found was that flicker was a cue to ground status as long as the edge was not flickering, because in that case, a non-flickering edge would have more in common with the non-flickering dots on this side, and thus be grouped with this region. However, if we flickered the edge in common with the flickering region, then suddenly we would have the flickering region looking figural. So we could reverse the figural status of the region depending on its relationship to the status of the edge, basically. So the key thing here was not that flickering was a cue to ground, it was what was the relationship between the edge and the region that mattered the most. And so what we found was that in addition to generating new predictions, our edge region grouping idea also explains some previously known effects, but now under one common principle, rather than a bunch of disparate ideas. Okay. Now, we also started to notice that other effects out there in the literature may be explainable under this edge region grouping idea. For instance, Barbara Gillum and Grove in 2011 published some work looking at the effect of texture entropy on figural assignment. So they had displays that looked like this. So they had sort of these bar stimuli, and some of the bars had texture in them. In this case, it's just a very regular line texture, horizontal line texture on the left-hand side here. On the right-hand, so those were considered to be low entropy textures. On the right-hand side, they also had stimuli that had what they called high entropy textures. So these are textures where the lines were sort of oriented in all sorts of different directions within the bars. What they found was that the entropy of the textures had an effect on figural assignment in these multipartite images. So what they found was that in low entropy textures, the low entropy texture bars tended to look figural. So you were more likely to see the texture bars in front and the blank bars as grounds. The opposite occurred in these high entropy texture lines. So now in these high entropy textures, you were more likely to see the blank bars as figural in front of high entropy backgrounds. And the conclusion from Gillum and Grove's work was that entropy is a ground cue. So anytime you have a high entropy region, that should be the background. However, what we noticed was that there may be an alternative interpretation of this work if you consider our edge region grouping idea. So Gillum and Grove varied the texture entropy of these two stimuli. But what they didn't vary at all was the entropy of the edges. So they always varied the texture entropy, but not that of the edges. So what we could do is really fill out a nice 2x2 design here, and we could start to vary the edge region grouping between the edges and the textures in the regions. So we added two conditions, and we redid their experiment, but added two conditions to it. One was now where we created some stimuli that had low edge region grouping. So in this case here on the top left, what we did is we have a low entropy texture, and we paired that with a high entropy edge, so a very zigzaggy edge. So now what we have is low entropy of the texture, but also low edge region grouping. And that is paired over here on the right with high entropy texture, but a low entropy edge, which means there's low edge region grouping, because the texture the texture over here doesn't go very well with the edge. There's low grouping and low grouping. And then we added another condition down here, which had high edge region grouping. So now we have a high entropy edge together with a high entropy texture. So these two edges, here the edge and the texture should go together really well. So the edge should be grouped with the high texture region. These textured regions should be in front and the blank regions should be in the back. Similarly to what happens here. So basically, we are now varying two things orthogonally. We're varying the texture entropy, which is what Gillam and Grove think affects figure ground organization, and we're varying the edge region grouping in these images, which is what we think may be able to explain what's going on. I think I forgot to point out here, the key thing that we're trying to do here is that although Gillam and Grove vary texture entropy, they confounded that with edge region grouping. So here in their low texture entropy, they have high edge region grouping because this low entropy edge goes together well with this low entropy texture. Whereas here they have low edge region grouping because the high entropy texture does not go very well with the low entropy edge. And so we're now just dissociating these two things and creating the full 2x2 design. Okay, so I'm going to plot the results here like Gillam and Grove did by applying the percentage of blank bars chosen. So we broadly replicated Gillam and Grove's effects when we just look at the when we look at their two conditions. So participants saw the high entropy texture. They saw the low entropy texture more as figural than sorry, I'm getting messed up here. They basically saw the blank bars as in front more often in this case here, where you have high entropy texture, than they did the case where you had low entropy texture. So our results were 34 and 58% compared to Gillam's 35 and 65%. So we basically replicated their effects. But then when we also, when we consider our two additional conditions, what we find is that basically the thing that drives figure ground assignment in these stimuli is not the difference between the two types of texture entropy. It's really edge region grouping that drives the effects in this experiment. So we see a clear main effect of edge region grouping, but no real main effect of texture entropy. So what we believe is that you can basically, the thing that drives in many of these cues, sometimes the thing that actually drives the effects is edge region grouping. And it's just not been considered because typically we're looking for features of either the edge or features of either the region in the stimuli, but we're not really considering the relationship between these two features, the relationship between the edges and the regions. And if you do that, then you can start to explain more of the variance in the data and also have alternative explanations for some existing phenomena. Okay. So, so that's some of the work we've done on edge region grouping, looking at relationships between edges and regions. But now what I want to switch to is something else, which is looking at another way that we can look at grouping in these images. So what I realized working with my students Anka Devila and Akul Satish is that sure, edges can group with regions, but edges can also group with one another in images, and this may have potential to create opportunities for figure ground organization. So if we take the classic sort of Rubin face vase image, like shown here, we typically see it looking something like this. This is pretty ambiguous. You can see it both as a face, two faces, or a vase. The key thing is that in this example, the two edges are the same color as one another. There's a suggestion that they may go together, but there's also some indication that they may not. But if I vary the image and I'll say that I have titrated this image by moving the edges backwards and forward apart to a certain distance to get it to be pretty ambiguous. So if you vary the amount of space between the edges to a certain amount, you can end up varying how much people are likely to see this as a face or a vase. This is really the principle of small area. If I make the vase area really small, then I can make the vase interpretation more common. Whereas if I make the vase area really big, I will make the face interpretation more common. So we've just sort of moved that around to make this a pretty ambiguous stimulus. But what we found is if we change one small thing about the image, if we basically just change the color of the two edges in this image, people now are much less likely to see this image as two faces, as a vase, and they're much more likely to see it as two faces. So now, whereas this was a more ambiguous image over here on the left, now this image is actually 86% of the time seen as faces by our participant. And this made us realize that there is something about this relationship between the two edges. In this case here, two edges that are of different colors or have very different features from one another are much less likely, probably, or seen as much less likely by the visual system to be part of the same object. You know, two different sides of me or two different sides of an object should have similar or correlated features. They shouldn't have very different features. And so in this image, the fact that there's a blue edge and a green edge suggests that they're not part of a common vase. They're not assigned to this common region between them, but in fact, they're two separate, unrelated objects. And this made us hypothesize that any factor which can cause grouping between edges favors figural assignment to the common region. And any time that any factors that cause disgrouping or ungrouping between two edges should mean that you do not assign figure to the common region. And we call this the inter-edge grouping hypothesis, this idea. And so this was our first test of it, but what we went on to do was try other types of grouping principles. And I'll show you some examples of those here. So I've shown you the color similarity example, but we also decided to try something that we tried for the edge region grouping, which was common fate. Because common fate cues tend to be quite strong. So when we have common fate grouping these two edges together, what we see is that people tend to see the vase more than they see the faces here, although they can still see the face interpretation. But when we have different motion in the two edges, basically people here find it very difficult to see the vase, and they see the faces interpretation 95% of the time. Presumably because with this type of motion, you would have to have some sort of non-rigid wobbly object between the two edges in order for this to be a vase shape. And then we also tried this with blur similarity between the edges. So for instance, if these two edges are in the same depth plane, presumably then part of the same object, they should have the same level of blur similarity. Whereas if they're in different depth planes, they should presumably have different levels of blur similarity, and you should see them as different objects. And that's what happens down here. When these two edges have different blur similarity, you see them more as faces than you see them as a vase. So these examples seem to suggest that there is something to this inter-edge grouping hypothesis, that if you can vary the grouping between edges as seen, then this can manipulate figure ground organization between these edges. So these were new phenomena that we hadn't seen before, but we thought that this might also relate to some extant figure ground principles, and maybe like we did before, like we used edge region grouping to explain some existing figure ground phenomena. Maybe we could use inter-edge grouping to also do the same thing. So one example of what we tried to look at was we thought, well, maybe convexity, which is a known figure ground principle, could also be explained by this idea of inter-edge grouping. So for instance, a convex stimulus might have a convex region may have these edges sort of curving in towards one another to make this a convex surface, whereas a non-convex region might have these edges pointing out away from one another so that they don't join together. Well, one way of interpreting that is that this region is convex and this region is not convex. But another way of framing that is that these two edges are grouped by good continuation or some sort of almost not collinearity in this case, but a good continuation or relatability. Whereas these edges are not relatable and not as groupable with one another as these are. And so in this way of looking at things, convexity is actually, or could be, an example of good continuation rather than an example of convexity itself. Regions, the small area grouping principle that I've already talked about, the figure ground principle that I've already talked about, that could be seen as inter-edge proximity. So small areas have edges that are closer to one another by definition. So that may be, so it may be that when we talk about proximity, we're actually talking about inter-edge grouping by, when we talk about small area, we're actually talking about inter-edge grouping by proximity. And similarly, symmetry may be grouping of these two edges by their symmetry that governs the figure ground organization. So the main point is here that there are some extant figure ground principles that we've known about for a long time that we could also incorporate within this idea of inter-edge grouping, suggesting that there's some sort of common mechanism or common idea underlying them, rather than them being just some completely different, unrelated principles. Okay, so that's another form of grouping that we think is involved in figure ground organization. So I've talked about two main ideas now, edge region grouping and inter-edge grouping. And I hope I've convinced you that both of these types of groupings seem to have some influence on figure ground organization. And now I'm going to tell you about a third way in which, my third and final way in which grouping seems to affect figure ground organization. And this is work that I did with John Driver. One of the things that we haven't talked about yet is much about how context influences figure ground organization. I alluded to this in my first example of when I started my talk, but I haven't actually shown you any data on that. I've just talked about, pretty much what's around an edge, immediately around it, affecting it. But I've not talked about what can happen are there any contextual influences on how figure ground organization is governed? And this was a question that John and I took up, and we did this by creating a very simple stimulus. So we created a stimulus in which we had a bipartite figure. This was basically a black and white region with the edge between the two regions oscillating back and forth. We called this our locally unbiased edge. So basically when people see this edge alone, they're pretty much 50-50 on which side is the figural region. And then we extended that stimulus to create this. So we had an apparent occluder, which was this red bar. And then we had another region which could be perceived as being connected to the locally unbiased region. But critically, this other region, or set of regions, had a locally biased edge. So in this case, the lower section of the display here, we've used our edge region grouping queue of common fate motion to make it look as if the left side is the figure and the right side is the ground. So this, the figure ground organization along this lower part of the edge should be absolutely clear. And then what we wanted to know was, despite the fact that this region up here has no local cues of figure ground organization, would the figural status of this edge up here be influenced by the locally biased edge down here, and under which conditions would that occur? So this is just to show that people generally perceive the locally biased edge as in front in the way that we predicted, 92% of the time in the left in this example. And what we found was that, and you can probably see this from your own perception, was that about more than chance, about 76% of the time, people would see the same region in the upper part of the display as figural in relationship to what was happening down here. So if the left side was figural in the lower part of the locally biased part of the image, then the left part of the left region would be figural in the locally unbiased section of the display as well. And the key message here was that it seemed that there is a sort of contextual effect on figure ground organization, that if one part of an edge has figure ground organization, that can propagate along the edge under an occluder and influence the figural status remotely in another part of the edge where there are no local cues. And this is probably important for maintaining the congruence, the consistency of figural status along edges across parts of the display. But we thought that there might be some limits on this propagation of figural assignment, and that may have something to do with grouping between these two edges in the display. So we created another condition in which we basically used color and motion cues to ungroup the two edges in the different sections of the display. So for instance, this edge down here is running kind of independently in its motion from the one up here. So literally these two edges could be seen as two parts of different objects, basically. And the question was, would we get some propagation of figural assignment between these two parts of the edge? We found that the local cue to figure ground organization was still very potent in the locally biased section of the display. But there was no propagation of edge assignment or figure ground organization from now from the locally biased section of the display to the locally unbiased section of the display. So it seems that the contextual propagation of figure ground assignment across different parts of an edge depends on those two edges being grouped. That grouping acts as a gating mechanism for propagation of figure ground organization between different segments of the display. So just as a summary, this is what I've outlined. So I've talked about three different ways in which grouping affects figure ground assignment. So I've talked about first edge region grouping. I've talked about inter-edge grouping, and now I've just briefly talked about this idea of context by grouping, that the contextual propagation of figure ground assignment is gated by grouping. And in addition to these new contributions to the literature on the principles of figure ground organization, one thing that I think we've also done is we've started to subsume some of the old existing principles into these frameworks. So for instance, when we talked about edge region grouping, we were able to explain some of the existing phenomena in figure ground literature under the umbrella idea of edge region grouping. And I suggest, although I can't definitively show this, that we can also subsume some of the classic figure ground principles of symmetry, small area, and other cues under inter-edge grouping. So hitherto unrelated principles can now be seen as instances of these new ideas. Now, I'm not saying that we can explain all figure ground principles under these few frameworks. There are some others that still are yet to be conquered and to be incorporated into a framework. But I think the shocking thing to me is that from starting off at the point at the beginning of this talk, where I was annoyed that reviewers were constantly conflating figure ground organization and grouping, I'm now in a totally different position where I'm basically explaining figure ground principles all as instances of grouping, or they can be thought of as instances of grouping one thing with another, edges with regions or edges with one another. And so I think this is a complete turnaround from the position I was in before. So thank you, reviewer number 2 in this instance, for prompting that to happen. Now, the final question I want to just briefly touch on here is, I'm suggesting that grouping is involved in all of these different figure ground principles and phenomena. But are all these phenomena really relying on the same mechanisms? Well, I'm not going to be able to answer that question in full today, but I'm going to take a stab at it. And this is work that I've done with my host today, which is that I'm going to talk about. So in our collaboration back when we were at UCL. And this was work that we published in 2012 with developmental agnostic patient, LG. I think at the time, LG was a 24-year-old right-handed male who has some difficulty recognizing faces and objects, but could still work and walk around the environment and had no gross structural abnormality of the brain, but sort of overall had poor integration abilities. And I didn't do any of this, work characterizing the patient. Sharon and colleagues have done a lot of that work of, characterizing the patient, and done significant neuroimaging work on the patient that they've published separately from the work I did together with them, showing that LG has some very curious activity in visual cortex, in particular showing deactivations of intermediate visual areas in response to visual stimuli. But I'm not going to go into that work because that's not work that I've done a lot on. But what we did with LG was we wanted to see if we could dissociate any of these different aspects of grouping in figure ground organization. And so we showed LG these stimuli that I've just described in my last study, where we had two types of grouping going on. One type of grouping was the grouping happening, the edge region grouping happening within the locally biased areas of the display. So the fact that the edge is moving together in common fate with the dots on the left-hand side here. But there's also this other type of grouping, which is the relationship between the edges in the upper and lower sections of the display. So the fact now that they are moving together in common fate and that the regions are the same colors and things like that. So there are two types of grouping going on here. And we want to see if either both of those are impaired, or if neither of them is impaired, or if one is impaired and the other is not impaired. And so what we did was we tested LG on whether they saw propagation of figural assignment from this locally biased region to the locally ambiguous region in 4 different conditions with different amounts of grouping between the top and bottom regions. And anything above 50% here indicates that there was propagation of figure ground assignment from one region to the other. Now, the white bars here that I've just plotted are controls. So this is what basically we would have seen in the past experiment, but these were additional controls tested for LG, where we find propagation when there is grouping, but no propagation when there's no grouping. And interestingly, for LG, we found that there was not really ever any propagation of figure ground organization. So basically, any grouping between the two different parts of the display was not effective in allowing figure ground organization to propagate from one region to another. However, you could argue that, well, maybe there was never any figure ground organization occurring whatsoever within the locally biased section, because that relied on grouping as well. But what we found testing the common fate stimulus, as well as many other contextual figure ground cues, was that LG was just as sensitive to local figure ground cues as the controls were. So this is the, we've tested different figure ground cues of all sorts of different types, including our edge region grouping ones, and broadly found a pretty strong correlation between LG's performance and the controls strength of the figure ground cues, suggesting that it wasn't the case that LG was just not able to perform edge region grouping. The actual figure ground cue down here, they were totally able to do that. It just wasn't able to propagate from one region to another. So they had edge region grouping intact, but they didn't have the grouping by context, context by grouping figure ground cue intact. So this suggests that some figure ground principles based on grouping, such as inter-edge grouping and edge region grouping, can operate independently of at least figure ground context by grouping, and maybe some of these other Gestalt principles that we tested. So there doesn't seem to be one particular unified mechanism between all of these, even though we can talk about them all as grouping. And I don't think that's surprising, given the different types of the physical differences in the types of grouping. I find it very surprising if they all share one mechanism. We're calling them one thing grouping, but they presumably do have somewhat dissociable mechanisms underlying. So I'm going to finish up, I think, broadly on time. I hope that it was meant to be about an hour. So basically the message from my talk is that many aspects of figure ground organization are like grouping. And I've shown you 3 different ideas that demonstrate that. I think that this, for me, has been this comment from reviewer number 2 has really been a fruitful way of exploring an idea that I was initially against, that these 2 phenomena were linked. Because I think that we talk about grouping and figure ground organization beside each other in textbooks, but we don't actually, we've never in the past really related them together mechanistically. We've never thought of them as being related in any way. And now I think we really can do that. And I think there will be more to explore here in the relationships between these phenomena going forward. And finally, I'll just finish with a plug that for those who are really interested in perceptual organization, there's a book, I think this came out in about 2015, edited by Johan Ragemans. And I have a chapter in this book on perceptual grouping, and there are many other chapters on various different aspects of perceptual organization. I think there's something like, there are 40 chapters. It's a huge book, basically. So if you want to really find out what I think some of the latest writing is on this area, this is a really good resource. And that is where I will stop. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'm inviting everybody to unmute themselves and give Joe a big applaud. It was really very interesting and actually fascinating new ideas about the relationship, and also about this idea that you were actually splitting the Rubin Vase phase, and by looking into another dimension. I've got questions myself, but I'm inviting other people to ask, and then I will I'll put myself in line.
Okay, I have a question. Can I?
Sure.
I wonder whether there is an even more basic common principle underlying both these phenomena, and that is simply the statistics of objects in the world. And the place I think that could be tested very easily is in this very interesting kinetic Rubin Vase phase that you showed, because I would predict that instead of having a wobbly object, you simply had the vase rotating back and forth, I mean, right, left, you will get a very strong vase relation and not face relation. I want you to comment on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think that looking at the natural statistics of these phenomena is really important. There is some work that's been done on that. So I think some work from computer science out of Jitendra Malik's lab, but also some work, other work on that. And I think that this is, but all of that work has largely been done with static images. Looking at natural statistics, I've not seen anything with dynamic images, presumably because it's quite difficult computationally to look at that work. But it's an area I would love to do work in, because I think there will be a lot to garner from that. But as far as I know right now, there's not a lot. But I think you're absolutely right. I think that I think that this is drawn on natural statistics of the images. You know, that in our world there are correlations and relationships between edges in the projected retinal image, and that we are picking up on that and using it. But I'd love to look at it.
Thanks.
I would like to follow on this. So if you agree that this is the result of the natural statistics, and so it was organized during development, right? The visual experience. So do you think maybe you try this way to go to the new models of the convolutional neural networks that may produce similar effect? Because now I started going into this and I see a lot of effects that explain early vision things like contour integration, but not, I didn't try yet figure ground or stuff like that, but I think it should follow that it should explain effects like this in a general way, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I don't know a lot about the convolutional neural networks work. So I think that's an area where, I mean, I've certainly been to plenty of posters at VSS on this lately. I have to admit, I'm not sure I completely understand the relationship there. So I'd be keen to talk about that more so I understand what it means. But I think on the issue of what you said about presumably it's picked up in development. I mean, I don't think it has to be picked up in development. It could be picked up evolutionarily as well, you know, I mean, and sort of, I mean, you know, picked up that way as well. So I don't know if these are statistics that are picked up over the development of an individual.
I think we have to be clear here that there are several levels of explanation. And yes, the natural statistics are, if you like, the reason why it's good to have a visual system that works that way. That's not quite the same thing as the explanation of how the visual system works. Just as you can give arguments from natural selection about all kinds of stuff in the biological world, that doesn't give you the physiology of what's going on.
Absolutely.
And just to follow up on that, it seems to me that you've got a beautiful set of demonstrations making some principles. The next stage in this argument might be to say, what kind of neural representation actually ties together things that are grouped, given the diversity of those things? You know, it's contours with contours, but also contours with surfaces. How on earth is that represented in a neural array? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't have specific experiments on that now, but I think that's why I would like to turn to next. And I think that you know, there are all sorts of ideas about how grouping works, or there have been ideas around synchrony. I'm not sure that I buy that will explain everything in these phenomena. yeah, I don't have specific ideas about that now, but it's definitely an area I would like to explore.
Thank you.
If I may comment, we found Rubin Vase phase effects in high order visual cortex.
Yeah. And there are certainly, I mean, there are certainly people looking at, I mean, there used to be a lot of neurophysiological work on figure ground organization coming from Rudiger von der Heit's lab, looking at V2. Mary Peterson, I think, has been looking at areas, some higher order areas, maybe V4. So I think there are a variety of different areas right now where people are looking for that sort of work. If I were going to do something, I think it would be a little bit less. I mean, my area of work is EEG, and I think the problem is that I've tried to do that, but finding ERP correlates, I think, has not been a figure ground organization has not been easy. And of grouping, there are some, but I've not found anything that tells me much about mechanism really at this point.
Joe, I'd like to ask about the issue. I mean, you said that there's some similarity between, I mean, you found that some similarity between grouping and figure ground. And I want to ask, I mean, figure ground is, or thinking about an edge assignment is kind of like segmenting the images into subsections. Whereas grouping can occur, I mean, even if in the examples that you have provided, you know, with the dots, and if they are grouped into lines or rows, they don't have to have an edge. It is really unclear. I mean, you could say these are clustered together, but it is unclear where the border actually lies. Do you understand what I'm saying? So it could be that grouping can be done when there's no actual contour that segments the image, whereas edge assignment is a clear segmentation of the image. I mean, this is, I don't know, this is just an intuitive, just sharing my thoughts with you about what is the relationship between them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, it makes me think that there's been for a while some interest in the relationship between these processes, but more about how they occur in time rather than how they're related to one another. So do you need to do one before you do the other, essentially, or not? And there was a lot of interest in that in the 90s. You know, Steve and Mary Peterson and a few others were commenting on this issue. Yeah, I mean, I think that it will not be the case. You will not need in all cases to in order to do grouping. So are you saying that for grouping you need to have one versus the other? You don't necessarily need a figure ground organization to occur in order to do grouping. Is that what you're saying?
Well, for example, grouping, you can have a few clusters, and it's really, it might not even be clear what is the figure and what is the ground. You could have, they could be just, you know, it doesn't have to be in a way hierarchical or something is, I mean, figure ground is basically thinking that something is somewhat closer to us and the other is further away. And in grouping, you can have just the whole scene grouped into things that are similar. None of them is more prominent or important than the other. It's just bisecting the visual image or the visual entities into a few groups. It's like a clustering thing. I mean, subset of that is actually figure ground, where you have some more, you know, prioritizing that something is more important than the other.
Well, I mean, I think there is a question about whether figure ground organization is prioritizing. So some of the work in the literature does look, I think some of the work, neurophysiological work, which is called figure ground organization, is not always referring to the same thing that I'm referring to, and I think the classic literature on figure ground organization refers to. So some of that work is really looking at what stands out, you know, maybe what has attention, whereas, you know, something that is figural doesn't necessarily need to be attended. So, you know, you could have something that's in front of something else, but you can be you attend to the background because that's what you're interested in for purposes of your task or something like that. So there's not always a sort of figure ground organization. The term is, it can be used quite differently in the literature sometimes. So depending on what area you're looking at, especially I think some of the neurophysiological literature sometimes uses that term differently than I'm using it. But yeah, I mean, you can have, you can have groups of stimuli that are grouped together that don't necessarily form a surface that has a defined edge. It may have an overall shape because it's been, perceived shape, but it doesn't have a border that needs to be assigned in the same way. Absolutely, you can have that as part of your phenomenal experience of a group. But in cases where you do have an edge, my argument is that grouping can be a useful concept to try to understand which regions may end up being perceived as the figure versus the background.
Yeah, very nice. There's a question in the chat from Yerdana. She wrote it, and I'll ask because maybe she doesn't have an audio. I'd like to ask about using eye tracker in the experiments shown, mainly because in some cases the figure ground segmentation wasn't very immediate. If eye tracker was used, was there any differences between the experiments? I mean, if I understand correctly, she's asking if you could see things through the eye tracking measurements, or were the eye movements through the data?
Yeah, so in some cases we did, in other cases we didn't. So in the LG experiments, we did not have eye tracking happening during those because I think it wasn't practical at that point. For some of the other experiments, we did have eye tracking because those were conducted in the lab. For the moving stimuli in particular, we wanted to make sure that people were fixating because those were longer presentations, and we wanted to have some control because they run for about 2 seconds. For the static stimuli, we tended to have very brief presentations of those, something like about 150 milliseconds. And we wanted people to basically give their first impression. Their instructions were to report the first interpretation of the stimulus because we didn't want perceptual ambiguity to be a thing. But for the motion stimuli, we had to present them longer just so that the motion would have time to unfold. And in those cases, we did have some eye tracking done during those experiments. And broadly, we showed that there wasn't, what we did in those experiments is we compared we had fixation probability maps that compared their average position between the two different perceptual outcomes in different conditions. We just didn't see much of a difference.
So that did not explain the effects that were observed psychophysically.
No.
Okay.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
So first, thank you for a wonderful talk. I was wondering if there's any cultural bias. So say Hebrew, we read from right to left, and English from left to right. So I'm not talking about familiarity of the actual letters, but just maybe the reading direction or other cultural effects.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I mean, it's not one, all of our experiments except for the LG experiment have been done with, I think, people that read left to right. I don't think we've seen, as far as I know, I don't think we've seen any particular bias towards side. So you might expect, someone to have a bias towards one side or the other because it's prioritized when people see it. We've generally not seen that in our display, in our results. It's pretty much been 50-50 left, right, as far as I know. I haven't looked at, I don't remember, I'd have to go back and look to see if there were any differences between LG and the controls, because that would be an interesting comparison to look at that, because I think the controls, I can't remember if we did the controls in London or if they were done in Israel. I think we did the controls in London. And so that would be a comparison that we could look at, where we would have a group basically different reading directions. But that would be an intercultural comparison. That would be interesting. Thank you. We haven't done it. I'm sorry I can't answer your question, but it would be interesting to look at.
Okay.
There's a query about the entropy, so-called entropy experiments by Barbara Gillam and yourself. In all cases, there were these textured regions, so we were trying to quantify, but there were also blank regions. It seems to me that you couldn't really assign an entropy or other measure to the blank regions, and wouldn't those experiments be better if both regions had a texture?
Yeah, I mean, that's the way Gillam and Grove did those experiments. And so we copied their design when we tested the edge region grouping hypothesis. I mean, I think they were treating the texture, the blank regions as kind of this neutral region, and they wanted to see whether low entropy or high entropy, how they would differ from nothing, basically, separately. And rather than putting them in direct competition with one another, I think they wanted to see whether you could bias from some neutrals. So the idea was that a blank region has nothing in it, which isn't necessarily the case, right? But it's some sort of neutral. And, which one would push away? So it could be that, high entropy would move you away, but low entropy wouldn't. And I think that that's what they were trying to get at in that comparison. When we did it, we followed their design to make, because I'm paranoid about not being able to replicate something if I change more than the one thing I'm interested in. But you would expect stronger effects if you would put them in competition with one another, presumably in the columns directly next to one another.
Thank you.
I would think.
Thank you very much, Joe, for a very inspiring and interesting talk. Bridging the gap between low-level and high-level vision, which is okay, very interesting. So,
Thank you. And just remember, reviewer 2 can sometimes be useful. So.
Always. Yeah. So let's again give a big applause to Joe. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And, we will meet again next week in the same time with Professor Woolley, who will speak about learning-induced changes in visual cortical processing. So join us next week as well. Joe, you're most welcome to also join us. You'll get the notification. And thanks again, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.